The Photo in the Adoption File. Chapter 1. The Cream Envelope on the Podium. My name is Eliza Moore, I am 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have been quietly humiliated, systematically dismissed, and treated as nothing more than an unfortunate contamination of my husband's aristocratic bloodline. Tonight, however, that quiet resentment was scheduled to escalate into a public execution. The great hall of St. Aldwyn's School smelled of old polished oak, expensive floral arrangements, and the quiet arrogance of wealth that had never been questioned. The vaulted ceilings of the Somerset boarding school amplified the murmur of the evening's attendees, a curated mix of local politicians, wealthy alumni, and the board members of the newly established Ashford Children's Trust. It was, by all outward appearances, a charitable gala dedicated to providing scholarships for children from complex backgrounds. In reality, it was a carefully constructed theater, and my mother-in-law, Beatrice Ashford, was both the director and the star. I sat at the front table, dressed in a muted charcoal gown that Beatrice had once politely suggested was a bit too corporate for a family event. Beside me, my husband, Julian, was adjusting his tie, his posture stiff with the kind of ancestral anxiety that always surfaced when he was in the same room as his mother. Our 18-month-old son, Leo, was peacefully asleep in his bespoke navy stroller, blissfully oblivious to the heavy legacy attached to his name. And then there was my daughter, Ava. She was 9 years old, wearing a beautiful navy blue velvet dress, sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. I looked down at the place cards resting against the crystal water goblets. Leo's card, printed in elegant gold cursive, read, Leonard Julian Ashford, Family Table. Ava's card, identical in font but entirely different in meaning, read, Ava Moore, Guest. I had noticed the discrepancy the moment we sat down. I did not cause a scene, nor did I bring it to Julian's attention. My profession as a child protection consultant had trained me to catalog discrepancies rather than react to them immediately. I simply moved Ava's chair a few inches closer to mine, ensuring our shoulders touched. Ava gave me a small, tight smile, her intelligent amber eyes betraying the deep, uncomfortable awareness of a child who understands she is being tolerated rather than welcomed. At the podium, Beatrice tapped the microphone, a diamond on her right hand catching the ambient light. She looked immaculate, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture straight as a ruler. Near the stage stood Martin Bellamy, the chief legal counsel for the trust, clutching a leather portfolio. 3 rows behind us sat Nora Vale, an investigative journalist invited to cover the benevolence of the Ashford family. The stage was set perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, Beatrice began, her voice carrying the practiced resonance of a former headmistress. Tonight, we are here to talk about legacy. We are here to discuss family. The Ashford Children's Trust is built upon the fundamental belief that every child deserves a clear origin, a foundation of absolute truth upon which they can build their future. The audience offered polite, appreciative applause. Julian smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. He thought this was a speech about charity. I felt the familiar, cold shift in the atmosphere. Beatrice's eyes had locked onto our table, and her smile did not reach the icy blue of her irises. She reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer and retrieved a thick, cream-colored envelope, placing it deliberately on the wooden surface of the podium. Legacy is not merely about wealth. It is about blood, heritage, and the undeniable truth of who we are, Beatrice continued, her gaze dropping to where Leo slept. Julian, my dear son, would you please join me up here for a moment? Julian looked surprised, a flush of color rising to his cheeks as he stood and buttoned his jacket. He walked up the short steps to the stage, looking out at the crowd with a modest smile. Beatrice placed a hand affectionately on his shoulder, then turned her attention to the room, her voice dropping to a tone of rehearsed sorrow. Before we officially launch this fund, there is a matter of administrative and moral clarity that must be addressed, Beatrice said smoothly. We are an institution that values honesty above all. Julian, before you continue to weave a child into the Ashford legacy, before you sign over trusts and family properties, I believe you deserve the clarity of truth. The great hall went completely silent. The clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased. The murmured conversations evaporated. I watched as Martin Bellamy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the exits. Beside me, Ava's small hand reached out and gripped the fabric of my dress, her knuckles turning white. "This envelope contains the results of a formal DNA kinship analysis," Beatrice announced, the words echoing off the stone walls. She turned slightly to ensure Julian was facing the audience. "It is my duty as a mother to protect you, Julian, even when the truth is devastating. The child you are raising is not who you have been led to believe he is." Julian turned ashen. He looked at the cream envelope, then down at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. Whispers began to ripple through the wealthy attendees. Several people turned their heads to stare directly at me, expecting a breakdown, a scream, or a tearful exit. Beatrice stood tall, radiating the solemn grace of a martyr performing a terrible but necessary duty. I did not stand up. I did not shout her down or try to snatch the microphone. I simply placed my hand over Ava's trembling fingers and met my mother-in-law's gaze. They thought they had cornered me in front of the entire county. What they didn't know was that the gray administrative folder sitting quietly inside my leather tote bag was about to make this entire room choke on its own silence. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how Beatrice Ashford managed to weaponize a medical document, you have to understand the history she was trying to erase. Let me take you back to where this carefully orchestrated hostility truly began. Chapter 2. The Woman with a Previous Life. For years before the gala at St. Aldwyn's, my life was entirely contained within the damp, limestone walls of a second-floor flat in Central Bath. I was 30 years old, newly divorced, and solely responsible for a 5-year-old Ava. My first marriage to Tom Moore had not ended in a spectacular explosion of infidelity or violence. It had dissolved through a slow, agonizing attrition of unpaid bills, broken promises, and his fundamental inability to be present. Tom was not a monster. He was simply a ghost who occasionally occupied our living room, draining our finances and emotional reserves before finally deciding that fatherhood was too heavy a coat to wear. When he left, he took the remaining balance of our joint savings account and left me with an impressive collection of final notices. I did not mourn the loss of the man, but I spent many nights sitting at the small kitchen table, calculating how many hours of overtime I needed to work to keep the heating on. My profession was not one that afforded luxury, but it demanded absolute precision. I worked as an adoption and child protection consultant for a regional family services organization. My days were spent navigating the wreckage of broken homes. I read through dense psychological evaluations, verified consent forms from overwhelmed young mothers, and fought for children who were being treated as bargaining chips in bitter custody disputes. I was fluent in the language of legal guardianship, risk assessments, and the subtle, insidious signs of parental manipulation. My work taught me one unshakable rule: there is absolutely no decision regarding a child's welfare that should be dismissed as just family business. The darkest, most damaging actions I had ever witnessed were always committed behind the heavy, closed doors of respectable homes, shielded by the excuse of protecting the family name. It was this very job that first brought Julian Ashford into my life. Our organization had secured a grant to build a specialized therapeutic playground for traumatized children, designed to offer sensory relief and safe boundaries. Julian's landscape architecture firm had won the contract. On a rainy Tuesday morning, he walked into my cramped office with a rolled-up set of blueprints and a quiet, unassuming demeanor that immediately disarmed me. He did not possess the loud, space-consuming confidence typical of men from his social strata. Instead, he listened intently, taking detailed notes when I explained how the height of a fence or the texture of a pathway could trigger or soothe a child with a history of neglect. Our professional meetings eventually transitioned into coffees, and those coffees extended into long dinners. Julian was kind, methodical, and deeply observant. What truly secured my affection, however, was his approach to Ava. When he first met her at a local park, he did not try to instantly buy her affection with oversized toys, nor did he demand that she perform for him. He simply sat on a bench, handed her a sketch pad, and asked if she wanted to draw the ducks with him. He allowed Ava to dictate the pace of their relationship, proving his reliability through consistency rather than grand gestures. As Julian and I grew closer, he spoke sparsely of his family. He mentioned that his parents lived on a large estate on the outskirts of Bath, that his father was a retired corporate solicitor, and that his mother, Beatrice, had once been the formidable headmistress of a private girls' school. He described his mother as deeply traditional, a phrase that my professional instincts immediately translated to controlling. During those early months of dating, I often found myself staying late at the office, digitizing physical archives to clear space in the filing room. It was during one of these late shifts that I encountered an old adoption file that lodged itself in my memory. It was a dusty, heavily redacted dossier from more than 30 years ago, originating from a wealthy Somerset jurisdiction. The case involved an infant girl who had been relinquished by a young mother. The names of the adoptive family and the biological parents were aggressively blacked out, which was standard, but the sheer volume of high-level legal correspondence attached to the file suggested immense wealth and a desperate need for secrecy. Tucked into the back pocket of the folder was a single, slightly blurry photograph. It depicted a terrified-looking young woman standing outside the wrought iron side gates of St. Aldwyn's School, awkwardly holding a bundle of blankets. The image haunted me because the young woman did not look like someone making a voluntary, informed decision about her child's future. She looked like a hostage. I could not investigate it further. The statute of limitations and data protection laws prevented me from reopening closed adoptions without a court order or a request from the adoptee, but I remembered the rigid posture of a second, older woman partially visible in the background of that photograph. At the time, I did not know the Ashfords. I did not recognize the wrought iron gates of St. Aldwyn's. I merely filed the dossier away, unaware that the terrified girl in the photograph and the wealthy family Julian belonged to were threads of the same tangled knot. I was only focused on building a stable, quiet life for Ava. Julian eventually proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in our small kitchen, sliding a modest but elegant diamond ring across the table while Ava was watching cartoons in the next room. I said yes because I loved him and because he promised that we would always be a team. But I would soon learn that marrying Julian meant marrying the entire Ashford legacy, a machinery designed to crush anything that did not perfectly fit its mold. Chapter 3. Beatrice Ashford pours tea with a scalpel. My formal introduction to Ashford House occurred 3 weeks after Julian and I announced our engagement. The estate was located just beyond the city limits of Bath, accessible via a long, winding gravel driveway flanked by ancient, imposing oak trees. The house itself was a sprawling Georgian manor, its stone facade draped in creeping ivy, projecting an aura of wealth that had been quietly compounding for generations. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax polish and expensive potpourri. The walls of the grand hallway were lined with heavy oil portraits and framed black and white photographs of Ashford ancestors, none of whom appeared to be smiling. Beatrice Ashford waited for us in the drawing room. She was a striking woman in her early 60s, wearing a tailored tweed skirt suit that looked simultaneously effortless and rigid. Her posture was flawless, a remnant of her years policing the hallways of elite educational institutions. As we entered, she set aside a porcelain teacup and rose to greet us. "Julian, darling," she said, offering her cheek for a brief kiss before turning her piercing blue eyes entirely on me. Her smile was structurally perfect, utilizing all the correct muscles without conveying a single ounce of warmth. "And this must be Eliza. It is so fascinating to finally match a face to the rather complex narrative Julian has shared with us." "It is wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Ashford," I said, ignoring the subtle barb. I stepped aside slightly, bringing Ava forward. "This is my daughter, Ava." Beatrice looked down at Ava. She did not kneel, nor did she soften her expression. "Hello, Ava. What a remarkably quiet child you are. Tell me, do you usually spend your weekends with your real father, or do you have a more flexible arrangement?" I felt a sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest. The phrasing was deliberate. It was not a genuine inquiry about custody schedules. It was a swift, surgical maneuver designed to immediately establish Ava's status as an outsider, a lingering symptom of a failed past. Ava's father is not a prominent part of our schedule, I replied smoothly, ensuring my tone remained perfectly pleasant. She and I are very much a package deal. Beatrice's smile widened a fraction of an inch. Her right hand drifted upward to touch a silver brooch pinned to her lapel, a beautifully crafted piece shaped like a swooping swallow. I would later learn that she almost always touched that specific piece of jewelry when she was evaluating an opponent's weakness. Of course, Beatrice murmured, gesturing for us to sit on the antique sofas. I have always admired women who are brave enough to start over, Eliza. Especially when they carry so many attachments from a previous life. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat. Mother, Eliza works as a consultant for family services. She's brilliant. The therapeutic playground I designed last month was actually for her organization. Family services, Beatrice repeated, pouring tea into delicate bone china cups. She handed me a saucer with a steady hand. How terribly noble. Mopping up the unfortunate consequences of broken homes and poor decision-making. It must be utterly exhausting to be surrounded by such failure every day. It is challenging, I said, taking a deliberate sip of the Earl Grey tea. But it mainly involves ensuring that vulnerable people aren't manipulated by those with more power or resources. I find the work very grounding. Beatrice paused, the silver teapot hovering in the air for a fraction of a second before she set it down. She looked at me with a new, calculating intensity. She realized in that moment that I was not going to shrink into the upholstery, nor was I going to apologize for my existence. During the ensuing dinner, Julian's father, Graham Ashford, made a brief appearance. Graham was a retired solicitor who communicated almost entirely in agreeable grunts and polite nods. He spent the meal hidden behind a veneer of detached exhaustion, clearly having surrendered the governance of his household to Beatrice decades ago. Julian's younger sister, Imogen, was also present. She mirrored her mother's immaculate grooming and possessed the same talent for delivering insults wrapped in polite inquiries. So, Eliza, Imogen asked while cutting her roast lamb, will you continue working after the wedding? Or will you focus on integrating Ava into a proper school environment? St. Aldwyn's has a lovely program, though their admissions criteria for older transfers can be rather strict regarding family background. I have no intention of leaving my career, I answered, keeping my voice level. And Ava is thriving beautifully at her current school. Throughout the evening, Julian intervened rarely, opting instead to pour more wine or steer the conversation toward neutral topics like architecture and weather. He hated conflict, an avoidance tactic honed by a lifetime of living under Beatrice's quiet tyranny. When we finally drove back to my flat in Bath, the silence in the car was heavy. Ava had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the rigid etiquette of the Ashford dining table. Julian reached across the center console and placed his hand over mine. I know they can be intense. My mother is just accustomed to a more formal way of speaking. She means well, Eliza. Family takes care of family in her eyes. You just have to give her time to adjust. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Family takes care of family. It was a phrase Beatrice had used twice during dinner, both times to justify an intrusive question about my finances. I did not argue with Julian that night. He was a good man, but he was fundamentally blind to the mechanics of his own family's cruelty. Beatrice Ashford did not use formal language because she was traditional. She used it because it provided plausible deniability. She did not intend to adjust to me. She intended to erase the parts of my life that did not serve the Ashford narrative, starting with my daughter. I knew then that I would need to treat my integration into the Ashford family the same way I treated a high-risk child protection case. I needed to observe, document, and prepare. I did not yet know about the DNA test she would illegally commission, nor did I know about the desperate secrets buried in Graham Ashford's past. But as I watched Ava sleep in the rearview mirror, I made a silent promise that I would never allow my daughter to become acceptable collateral damage in Beatrice Ashford's pursuit of a perfect family portrait. Chapter 4. The Young Attendant. Julian and I were married 6 months later in a historic, limestone-faced chapel nestled in the architectural heart of Bath. It was originally intended to be a small, intimate ceremony, restricted to close friends and immediate relatives. However, Beatrice had quietly and methodically expanded the guest list over the preceding months, ensuring the pews were filled with board members from her various charitable trusts and partners from Graham's former law firm. She treated the wedding not as a union of two people, but as an excellent networking opportunity masquerading as a family milestone. Throughout the planning process, Julian had been absolutely adamant about one specific detail. He wanted Ava to walk down the aisle with us. He viewed it as a necessary physical representation of two separate lives merging into one unified household. When he first proposed the idea during a Sunday lunch at Ashford House, I braced myself for Beatrice's resistance. Instead, she had smiled with perfect warmth and agreed without a single moment of hesitation, even offering to help select Ava's dress. I should have recognized the danger in her immediate, frictionless compliance. My professional experience in family dynamics had taught me a very reliable lesson. When a highly controlling personality yields too quickly on a matter of principle, it simply means they have already found a backdoor to secure their original objective. I discovered Beatrice's backdoor on the morning of the ceremony. While getting dressed in the bridal suite, I picked up one of the heavy, cream-colored order of service programs that Beatrice had insisted on having professionally printed at a boutique stationery shop in London. I scanned the elegant cursive font, my eyes moving past the names of the officiant, the musicians, and Julian's parents. Beneath them was the section detailing the bridal party. Ava was not listed as the daughter of the bride. She was not listed under the heading of family. Her name had been relegated to the very bottom of the page, printed in a noticeably smaller, italicized font, Ava Moore, young attendant. The phrasing was entirely deliberate. It stripped Ava of any familial permanence, making her sound less like a beloved daughter and more like a hired flower girl brought in temporarily for aesthetic purposes. I ran my thumb over the raised ink of the letters, a cold knot tightening in my chest. I did not march out of the room to demand a reprint, nor did I show the program to Julian in the frantic hour before the vows. I simply folded the thick cardstock and placed it securely into my leather handbag, the very first piece of physical documentation in what would soon become a heavily populated file. The exclusion continued to manifest during the reception at the Royal Crescent Hotel. After the dinner service, the hired photographer began arranging the guests for the formal portraits. We moved through the standard configurations smoothly enough, capturing images of my small extended family and the sprawling network of Ashford relatives. Then, Beatrice approached the photographer, murmuring something quietly while touching the silver swallow brooch pinned to her elegant evening jacket. The photographer nodded, adjusted his lighting umbrella, and addressed the room. If I could just get the immediate Ashford family for this next sequence, he requested politely, gesturing toward the center of the room. Ava, who had been standing beside me with her small hand wrapped securely in the fabric of my gown, looked up at me in confusion. Before I could pull her closer to my side, Beatrice materialized beside us. She placed a gentle, manicured hand on Ava's shoulder and guided her smoothly away from the camera's focal point. "Just for a moment, darling, so we can capture the generations properly," Beatrice said to my daughter, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She positioned Ava next to a large, towering floral arrangement on a side table, effectively removing her from the frame while maintaining a veneer of grandmotherly guidance. Julian noticed the physical separation immediately. He shifted his weight nervously, his eyes darting between his mother's rigid smile and Ava's isolated figure standing awkwardly by the hydrangeas. He leaned down toward my ear, his breath warm against my cheek. "I am so sorry about this, Eliza. I will speak to my mother about it as soon as the photos are done," he whispered apologetically. He never did. He allowed the moment to pass, choosing the path of least resistance to avoid spoiling the celebratory atmosphere. The photograph was taken, permanently preserving a pristine image of the Ashford legacy with my 9-year-old daughter conspicuously absent. Beatrice's final maneuver of the evening occurred during the toasts. She requested the room's attention by gently raising her crystal champagne flute, waiting for the ambient conversation to naturally fade into respectful silence. She stood at the head table, radiating the practiced confidence of a woman entirely accustomed to commanding a captive audience. "Our Julian has always possessed a remarkably generous heart," Beatrice announced, her gaze sweeping benevolently across the room of wealthy guests. "Today, he is not merely marrying a wonderful, capable woman. He is opening his home and his life to a narrative that began long before him. It takes a truly exceptional man to embrace an entire history that he did not write." The audience offered a round of warm, appreciative applause, entirely captivated by the apparent grace and magnanimity of the sentiment. I maintained a pleasant, fixed smile on my face, but my eyes remained locked on Beatrice. I recognized the statement for exactly what it was, a velvet-wrapped insult. She was publicly framing Julian as a savior, and in doing so, she was permanently branding Ava and me as a tragic burden he had mercifully agreed to carry. I glanced down at Ava, who was staring blankly at her half-eaten slice of wedding cake, fundamentally aware that she was the prior narrative being so generously tolerated by the room. The dynamic shifted again shortly after our honeymoon, when I discovered I was pregnant with Leo. The announcement seemed to trigger a profound and immediate change in Beatrice's demeanor. The polite, icy distance she had maintained since our first meeting suddenly evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming, almost suffocating attentiveness. She began visiting our home unannounced, bringing a continuous stream of extravagant gifts. There were cashmere blankets sourced from Scotland, heavy silver rattles engraved with traditional family crests, and vintage rocking horses that had supposedly been stored in the Ashford attic for decades. She was entirely invested in my well-being, scheduling appointments with top-tier private obstetricians and offering unsolicited advice regarding maternal nutrition. But her generosity was not actually directed at me, and it certainly was not directed at Ava. Every single gift she brought into our home carried a small, elegantly handwritten card attached by a satin ribbon. For the newest Ashford. For Julian's first. For the continuation of the family. There was never a mention of a little brother for Ava. There was never an acknowledgement of our blended household. Beatrice was using the pregnancy to draw a definitive, unbreachable line in the sand. In her mind, one child was a charity case inherited from a failed marriage, while the other was the legitimate continuation of the Ashford bloodline. I did not throw the gifts away, nor did I attempt to argue with Beatrice about the phrasing on her elegant little cards. Instead, I carefully untied the ribbons, collected the heavy paper tags, and placed them into the same gray administrative folder that held the wedding program. My silence was not born of submission, it was born of profound observation. I understood that systemic family exclusion never announces itself with a megaphone or an outright declaration of war. It creeps in gradually through the margins of printed programs, the strategic framing of family photographs, and the deliberate phrasing of congratulatory cards. I was building a record of her methodology, entirely unaware that Beatrice was simultaneously preparing a trap that would attempt to sever my children's bond at the genetic level. Chapter 5. A child too much like his sister. Leo was born on a crisp Tuesday morning in a private maternity suite overlooking the pale stone architecture of the city. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and expensive linen, a sterile environment softened only by the overwhelming, exhausted relief that follows hours of labor. Julian wept openly when he held his son for the first time, cradling the small, tightly swaddled blanket as if he were holding something made of spun glass. Ava stood quietly near the foot of my bed, her hands resting on the metal railing, watching Julian with a mixture of awe and profound uncertainty. She eventually stepped closer, resting her chin near my knee, and asked in a very quiet voice whether the baby knew she was his older sister. I reached out, brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead, and assured her that he absolutely did. I told her that brothers always know who their sisters are, a promise that seemed to visibly loosen the tension in her small shoulders. The fragile peace of our newly expanded family lasted exactly 3 hours. The heavy oak door of the maternity suite swung inward, revealing Beatrice Ashford carrying an extravagant arrangement of pristine white lilies and a large, custom-made teddy bear wearing a silk ribbon embroidered with the Ashford family crest. She glided into the room with the practiced elegance of a monarch inspecting a newly acquired territory. Beatrice bypassed me entirely, offering only a brief nod in my direction before moving straight to Julian. She leaned over her son, her eyes fixing immediately on the sleeping infant in his arms. She reached out to brush her manicured finger against Leo's cheek, her expression softening into something that almost resembled genuine warmth. "Oh, Julian," Beatrice murmured, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Finally, you have someone to properly carry the line forward. The first true Ashford of this generation." The word "finally" hung heavily in the sterile air, thick and deliberate. I looked immediately at Ava, who had instinctively taken a half-step backward toward the window. Julian was entirely consumed by the emotion of new fatherhood and did not register the implication, but my professional instincts cataloged the phrasing instantly. Beatrice was not merely welcoming a grandson, she was drawing a definitive, verbal boundary around him, establishing who belonged inside the family vault and who remained permanently outside on the pavement. As the months passed, however, biology began to mount a quiet, undeniable rebellion against Beatrice's grand narrative. Leo grew from a delicate newborn into a robust, observant toddler, and as his features settled, it became strikingly apparent that the Ashford lineage had been thoroughly overpowered. Leo possessed my amber eyes, a distinctive shade of light brown flecked with gold, entirely unlike the icy, aristocratic blue that defined Julian, Beatrice, and Imogen. More remarkably, when Leo smiled, he revealed deep, asymmetrical dimples that were an exact, mirrored match to Ava's. They shared the same slightly unruly dark hair and the same arched brow when they were confused. Side by side, sitting on the living room rug surrounded by building blocks, they looked undeniably and profoundly connected. The family noticed the resemblance immediately, and the commentary began to flow disguised as polite, drawing-room conversation. During a Sunday lunch at the Ashford estate, Beatrice spent a considerable amount of time observing the children playing near the fireplace. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water, setting the crystal glass down on the tablecloth with deliberate care. "It is utterly fascinating, isn't it?" Beatrice remarked smoothly, directing her gaze toward Julian, but ensuring her voice carried down the length of the table to me. "How two children with entirely different fathers can look so remarkably identical. One would almost assume they share the exact same parentage." Julian laughed softly, entirely missing the sharp edge hidden beneath the silk. "Eliza just has incredibly dominant genetics, Mother." The Ashford blue eyes never stood a chance against her side of the family. "Yes, indeed," Imogen added from across the table, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully. "The Moore genes certainly do not negotiate. They just arrive and take over the entire space." Later that same evening, Imogen posted a photograph to her social media accounts. It was a candid shot of Ava holding a sleeping Leo on the sofa, bathed in the warm afternoon light of the estate. The caption beneath the image read exactly what she had said at dinner: "Those Moore genes don't negotiate." When I showed the post to Julian as we were preparing for bed, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck in an exhausted gesture of dismissal. "Imogen is just making a harmless joke about how much they look alike, Eliza," Julian reasoned, his tone gently imploring me not to create a conflict. "She loves them both. My family is just having a bit of fun with the fact that neither of the kids inherited my nose or my eyes." "You are reading too much into an innocent observation." I did not argue with him. I simply placed my phone on the nightstand, turned off the bedside lamp, and lay in the darkness. I was not reading too much into the situation. Julian was simply refusing to read it at all. My career in family services had taught me that a systematic campaign to undermine a parent never begins with explosive accusations. It begins with tiny, socially acceptable seeds of doubt planted in public spaces. It begins with harmless jokes about paternity and fascinating observations about physical traits. I understood exactly what Beatrice and Imogen were doing. By constantly highlighting the physical similarities between Ava and Leo, and by constantly referencing my first husband, they were attempting to mentally sever Leo from Julian's side of the family tree. I began recording the dates, times, and exact phrasing of these comments in a secure, encrypted document on my personal laptop. I was not plotting a revenge strategy. I was simply following the fundamental protocol of any seasoned investigator. When the environment becomes unpredictable, you start establishing a timeline. The situation escalated from verbal microaggressions to physical boundary crossing on a damp, overcast Tuesday afternoon when Leo was 18 months old. Beatrice had unexpectedly offered to take the children for a few hours while I attended a mandatory virtual training seminar for my organization. She arrived at our Bath flat with her driver, insisting that the fresh air of the estate gardens would be excellent for their constitutions. I reluctantly agreed, securing Leo into his car seat and handing Ava her favorite denim jacket. When Beatrice returned them precisely 3 hours later, the atmosphere in the hallway felt distinctly off. Beatrice was entirely too cheerful, overly solicitous, as she helped Ava remove her muddy boots. "They were absolute angels, Eliza," Beatrice declared, handing me the heavy diaper bag. Leo had a wonderful nap in the sunroom, and Ava spent the afternoon drawing in the library. We had a lovely, quiet time. I thanked her politely, waiting until her town car had pulled away from the curb before bringing the children inside and beginning the routine process of unpacking their belongings. It was during the evening bath routine that I noticed the first discrepancy. I reached into the side pocket of the diaper bag to retrieve Leo's favorite wooden teething ring, a smooth, untreated maple circle that he carried almost everywhere to soothe his gums. The pocket was completely empty. I searched the main compartment, checked the floor of the hallway, and thoroughly examined the pockets of his small coat. The teething ring was gone. 30 minutes later, Ava walked into my bedroom wrapped in her warm towel, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders. She looked slightly distressed, her hands twisting the fabric of the towel together. "Mom, I cannot find my tortoiseshell hairbrush," Ava said quietly, looking back toward the hallway. "I know I packed it in my small backpack because I brushed my hair after we played in the garden, and I left it on the small table in the Ashford Library. But it is not in my bag anymore." I stood perfectly still in the center of the bedroom, a profound and terrifying clarity washing over me. Beatrice had not lost a wooden teething ring. She had not accidentally misplaced a child's hairbrush. I worked in an industry where biological evidence was frequently weaponized in custody battles and parental disputes. I knew exactly what kind of material a laboratory required to extract a viable DNA sample from a minor without subjecting them to a formal medical swab. Saliva from an extensively used teething ring. Hair follicles gathered from the bristles of a personal brush. My mother-in-law was not just attempting to mentally distance Leo from Julian anymore. She was actively crossing an illegal, invasive boundary to forcefully rewrite our reality. They were not looking at my children with love, they were viewing them as genetic specimens waiting to be processed. I did not call Beatrice to demand the return of the items. I walked quietly into the bathroom, found a spare comb for Ava, and helped her dry her hair. I maintained a calm, steady exterior, projecting absolute safety for my daughter, while my mind began to methodically prepare for the war Beatrice Ashford had just silently declared. Chapter 6. An Invitation to the Scholarship Fund. The invitation arrived precisely 2 weeks after the incident with the missing teething ring and the hairbrush. It did not come in the form of a casual text message or a phone call, but rather a thick, monogrammed envelope delivered directly to my office by a courier. Beatrice Ashford was requesting my presence for a private afternoon tea at the Pump Room in Bath. The venue itself was a calculated choice. The Pump Room was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, characterized by its towering Corinthian columns, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and an undercurrent of centuries-old privilege. It was a space designed for formal negotiations and quiet displays of power, a place where voices were rarely raised above a polite, melodic murmur. When I arrived, Beatrice was already seated at a prime table near the tall windows overlooking the ancient Roman baths, sipping from a delicate cup and observing the room with the serene authority of a sovereign holding court. "Eliza, my dear," Beatrice greeted me as I took the seat opposite her. She offered a flawless, unreadable smile, gesturing gracefully for the waiter to pour my tea. "Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice. I know how terribly demanding your administrative duties must be." I arranged my napkin in my lap and met her gaze directly. It was not a problem, Beatrice. My schedule was relatively flexible this afternoon. What did you want to discuss? She did not immediately answer. She waited until the waiter had arranged a silver-tiered stand of delicate pastries and cucumber sandwiches between us before she leaned forward, her silver swallow brooch catching the ambient light of the chandeliers. I wanted to speak with you about the future, Beatrice began, her tone perfectly modulated to project maternal concern. Julian is coming into his own within the family businesses, and as you know, I am currently establishing a new scholarship branch for the Ashford Children's Trust. We are partnering with St. Aldwyn's School to launch an initiative for children with complex backgrounds. It is a massive undertaking, and it requires a pristine public image. I took a slow, measured sip of my Earl Grey tea, allowing the silence to stretch between us just long enough to signal that I was listening, but not agreeing. It sounds like a very noble endeavor. It is a necessary one, Beatrice corrected gently. The Ashford name carries a certain weight in Somerset. I would very much like Julian and little Leo to be the modern faces of this new initiative. A father and his son, representing the continuation of our charitable legacy. The press will find it absolutely charming. She paused, watching my face carefully for any sign of resentment or insecurity regarding Leo's elevation as the sole family mascot. When I offered nothing but a polite nod, she deployed her secondary maneuver. Naturally, I understand that blending a household is complicated, Beatrice continued, her voice softening into a register that almost sounded like genuine sympathy. I have spoken with the Trust's board, and I believe we can quietly arrange a secondary educational grant for Ava. St. Aldwyn's has a rather exceptional program for older transfer students. I am willing to sponsor her admission entirely, provided, of course, that we have all the family paperwork clearly organized and formalized in advance. The offer was staggering in its financial value, yet deeply insidious in its execution. She was dangling a premier, debt-free education for my daughter, but she was framing it as a charitable donation requiring administrative clearance. She was not offering Ava a place in the family, she was offering her a place in the Trust's external philanthropy portfolio. Before I could form a diplomatic response, Beatrice reached into her structured leather handbag and produced a sleek manila folder. She slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it rested next to my saucer. My solicitors have drawn up a few standard administrative forms to expedite the process, Beatrice explained casually, dismissing the documents with a light wave of her manicured hand. It is mostly rudimentary boilerplate. Medical history disclosures for Leo to establish his baseline health insurance through the family estate, confirmation of primary guardianship, and a few consent waivers required by the Trust's compliance officers. You can just sign them here, and I will have my driver deliver them to Martin Bellamy's office this afternoon. I did not reach for the pen she placed beside the folder. Instead, I opened the cover and began to read the documents with the exact, methodical scrutiny I applied to child welfare reports at my office. The first 2 pages were exactly what she claimed them to be, standard insurance declarations and routine guardianship affirmations. However, the 3rd page was structurally different. The header belonged to the Trust, but the legal phrasing within the body paragraphs was overly clinical. It included clauses granting the Ashford Children's Trust broad authorization to collect, store, and process biometric data, medical baselines, and genetic history markers for both minor children listed in the primary household. At the bottom of the page was a designated box for a digital authorization signature, perfectly aligned with the exact format used by private medical laboratories. Beatrice was attempting to trick me into legally backdating my consent for the DNA samples she had already stolen. These are quite comprehensive, I noted, keeping my voice entirely devoid of accusation. I closed the folder smoothly and slipped it into my work tote. I will need to review these specific data processing clauses thoroughly. Given my profession, I am naturally very particular about signing away biometric consent for minors. I will read through them tonight and discuss the parameters with Julian. The muscles in Beatrice's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, the only physical betrayal of her frustration. She quickly recovered her mask of serene benevolence, though the temperature in her eyes dropped significantly. Of course, Beatrice smiled, touching her swallow brooch again. "I suppose your profession revolves around reading such sad, suspicious little details all day. It must be terribly difficult to simply trust anyone when you are so accustomed to dealing with people who constantly lie." "It does teach you to look at the paperwork rather than the promises," I replied evenly. I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. "Thank you for the tea, Beatrice. I will be in touch regarding the documents." I walked out of the pump room with a steady, unhurried pace, feeling the physical weight of the manila folder against my side. I knew that rejecting the forms on the spot would force her hand, but I did not fully understand the scope of her desperation until later that evening. By 9 o'clock, the flat was quiet. Julian was in the living room, sketching a new landscape proposal, and the children were both asleep in their respective beds. I sat at the small desk in our bedroom, the glow of my laptop illuminating the quiet space. I was reviewing the digital drafts of the consent forms when a new notification appeared in my primary inbox. The sender address belonged to an automated system at Wessex Kinship and Genetics, a high-end private laboratory located on the outskirts of Bristol. The subject line read, "Action required. Parental consent verification for pending analysis." My pulse remained steady, but a cold, heavy clarity settled into my chest. I opened the email, scanning the sterile, formatted text. The laboratory's automated compliance system had flagged a newly submitted testing request. According to the United Kingdom's Human Tissue Act, analyzing biological samples for DNA without proper, verified consent is a criminal offense, particularly when minors are involved. The system had detected a discrepancy in the submission protocol and was legally obligated to send an automated confirmation to the registered email address of the primary legal guardian, an address they had pulled from the falsified medical records Beatrice had undoubtedly supplied. I scrolled down to the summary of the pending analysis. Beatrice had not commissioned a simple paternity test between Julian and Leo. The testing parameters listed in the email clearly detailed a comparative sibling kinship analysis. The two biological samples currently sitting in the Wessex laboratory awaiting my digital authorization belonged to Leonard Ashford and Ava Moore. I stared at the glowing screen, rereading the names of my children framed within the clinical parameters of a genetic processing queue. Beatrice was not just trying to prove that Leo was not Julian's son. She was using Ava's stolen hair follicles to run a comparative analysis, planning to use the inevitable genetic match between the two half-siblings to construct a fabricated narrative that they shared the same biological father. She had dragged my 9-year-old daughter into a sterile laboratory system, reducing her to a biological tool designed to destroy my marriage and secure the Ashford inheritance. I did not run into the living room to scream at Julian. I did not call Beatrice to demand an explanation or threaten her with legal exposure. I understood in that exact moment that this was no longer a matter of a toxic mother-in-law suffering from aristocratic snobbery. This was a severe, premeditated violation of my children's bodily autonomy, and I was going to dismantle her entirely using the very systems she thought she could manipulate. I opened a secure, encrypted channel on my laptop, attached the forwarded automated email, and drafted a brief, precise message to Sion Pritchard, the compliance director listed at the bottom of the Wessex Genetics portal. Then, I closed the laptop, the soft glow fading into the darkness of the bedroom, leaving behind only the quiet, absolute certainty of what I had to do next. Chapter 7. 2 samples and a forged signature. I waited until 9 o'clock the following morning, ensuring Julian had already left for his architectural firm and Ava was safely dropped off at her primary school. The flat was entirely silent, bathed in the gray, muted light of a typical Somerset morning. I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, a fresh notepad positioned next to my coffee cup, and dialed the direct compliance number for Wessex Kinship and Genetics. I did not use my personal, conversational voice. I used the precise, flattened tone I reserved for uncooperative local authorities and hostile opposing counsel in child welfare cases. "My name is Eliza Moore," I stated the moment a representative answered. "I am the primary legal guardian for 2 minors currently registered in your processing queue under the names Leonard Ashford and Ava Moore." I am calling to issue a formal administrative hold on this account due to fraudulent consent. The representative's customer service demeanor vanished immediately, replaced by the cautious hesitation of someone who understood they were suddenly standing on precarious legal ground. Within 3 minutes, I was transferred to Dr. Sion Pritchard, the facility's Director of Compliance and Data Protection. Dr. Pritchard was professional, sharp, and clearly prioritizing the laboratory's liability over client confidentiality. Once I provided the necessary verification to prove my identity and guardianship, she opened the digital file associated with my children. Mrs. Ashford, our system flagged the submission protocol late yesterday evening, Dr. Pritchard explained, the tapping of her keyboard audible through the receiver. The client who initiated the request, a Mrs. Beatrice Ashford, submitted a digital authorization form claiming she had secured your express maternal consent to facilitate a sibling kinship analysis. I did not provide consent, verbally or otherwise, I replied evenly, writing Beatrice's name down on my notepad despite already knowing the answer. Can you tell me how the authorization signature was rendered? It was a scanned image file uploaded to the portal, rather than a live digital signature executed through our secure server, Dr. Pritchard confirmed. That is precisely what triggered our automated compliance flag. Furthermore, the IP address associated with the device that uploaded the documents tracks back to a residential network registered in Bath. The estate name is Ashford House. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. Beatrice had not just lied to a medical facility, she had committed a deliberate act of forgery. I thought back to the endless forms I had filled out over the past year, emergency contact sheets for Leo's pediatrician, dietary waivers for family holidays, permission slips. She had likely lifted my signature from one of those mundane documents, digitized it, and attached it to a request that violated the most fundamental rights of my children. I need a complete cessation of all processing on those samples immediately, I instructed, my voice remaining entirely steady. I also require a certified audit trail of every interaction Mrs. Ashford has had with your portal, including timestamps, IP logs, and the original forged authorization document she uploaded. You will lock those results behind an administrative firewall, and they are not to be released to anyone but me. Dr. Pritchard agreed without hesitation. She understood the severe implications of violating the Human Tissue Act regarding minors. The samples would be frozen, the data secured, and the audit trail dispatched to my secure email within the hour. When I ended the call, the silence in the apartment felt heavier. I had the evidence of Beatrice's crime, neatly packaged in server logs and IP addresses. The natural, emotional impulse was to call Julian, demand he drive to his mother's estate, and force a confrontation. Instead, I called Priya Desai. Priya was an independent family law solicitor in Bristol who specialized in data protection and high-conflict custody resolutions. We had worked alongside each other on several difficult cases over the years. She was pragmatic, unsentimental, and possessed an incredible talent for recognizing the shape of a trap before it snapped shut. I relayed the events of the past 24 hours to Priya in chronological order: the missing teething ring, the hairbrush, the tea at the pump room, the boilerplate forms, and finally, the automated email from Wessex Genetics. Priya listened without interrupting. When I finished, I heard the faint scratching of her pen against paper. "Do not call Beatrice," Priya advised, her tone absolute. "And do not call Julian right now while your blood is running hot. You know exactly how this specific family dynamic operates, Eliza. If you confront him without an airtight strategy, he will default to his lifelong training. He will call his mother. And she will claim it was a misunderstanding." I finished the thought for her. "Exactly," Priya confirmed. "She will cry. She will say she was simply trying to verify Leo's medical history for the trust and that her assistant must have uploaded the wrong signature file. Julian will want to believe her because believing you means acknowledging his mother is a monster. He will force a reconciliation, and the entire incident will be swept under one of their expensive Persian rugs." Priya was entirely right. Beatrice's greatest weapon was her ability to retreat into the armor of aristocratic, maternal concern. I could not just expose the forged signature, I had to expose her intent. "So, what is the legal maneuver?" I asked, looking down at the gray folder resting on my desk. Let her build her own gallows, Priya said quietly. If she intends to use whatever results she thinks she possesses to publicly humiliate you at this upcoming trust gala, let her bring the envelope to the podium. You need witnesses to her malice, Eliza. You need the board members and the lawyers to see her deploy a weaponized medical document. But before she does, you need to build an impenetrable wall around your son. I understood the assignment immediately. The kinship test Beatrice commissioned was inherently flawed because she had stolen DNA from two siblings who shared the same mother. The results would naturally show a biological connection, which Beatrice clearly planned to misinterpret as proof that they shared the same father, my ex-husband, Tom. To permanently dismantle her narrative, I needed a document that carried absolute, irrefutable legal weight. I need a court-admissible chain of custody paternity test, I told Priya. One executed in a clinical setting with verified government identification, witnessed by a third party. Between Julian and Leo. I will schedule it at a secure clinic in Bath for tomorrow afternoon, Priya confirmed efficiently. Get Julian to sign the consent forms. Do not tell him about his mother's forgery yet. Just get his signature. That evening, I waited for Julian in the kitchen. I had prepared dinner, maintaining a facade of domestic normalcy while a printed stack of legally binding medical documents rested on the granite counter beside the fruit bowl. When Julian walked in, loosening his tie and looking exhausted from a long day of client meetings, I poured him a glass of wine and slid the paperwork toward him. He picked up the first page, his brow furrowing as he read the bold header of the clinical facility. "Eliza, what is this?" he asked, looking up at me with genuine confusion. "A verified chain of custody paternity test? Why on earth would we need to do this for Leo?" I looked at my husband. He was a decent man, trapped inside a family machinery he refused to fully acknowledge. I felt a brief flash of guilt for manipulating the situation, but the memory of Ava's stolen hairbrush hardened my resolve. "Your mother has made it very clear that the Ashford Children's Trust requires pristine documentation," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and entirely calm. "She handed me a stack of waivers yesterday at the pump room. It got me thinking about the board, the trustees, and the sheer amount of money involved in Leo's future." Julian sighed, leaning against the counter. "I told you, she just likes paperwork. You don't have to take it to this extreme." "I am not taking it to an extreme, Julian. I am creating a permanent shield," I replied, holding his gaze. "I do not ever want anyone in your family, or on that board, to question Leo's place in this legacy behind closed doors. I want a document, signed by a doctor and verified by a laboratory, that proves exactly who he is. A document no one can ever challenge." Julian looked at the papers, then back at me. He heard the protective instinct in my voice, but he completely missed the underlying target. He thought I was aggressively protecting Leo from abstract corporate trustees. He did not realize I was building a barricade against his own mother. "You really think it's necessary?" he asked softly, picking up the pen. "I know it is," I answered. Julian signed his name on the designated lines without reading the fine print, entirely trusting my judgment. He handed the documents back to me, kissed my forehead, and walked into the living room to greet Ava. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the fresh ink of his signature. I carefully aligned the pages, slipped them into the gray administrative folder, and placed it inside my leather tote bag. The countermeasure was secured. The trap Beatrice was meticulously laying for me was about to become the exact mechanism of her own destruction. I just had to wait for the Wessex kinship portal to release the final audit report, unaware that the data waiting inside those locked files was about to hand me a weapon far more devastating than a forged signature. Chapter 8. The name Nora Vale. The encrypted file from Wessex Kinship and Genetics arrived in my secure inbox at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning. Dr. Pritchard had true to her word, freezing the analysis process and releasing the preliminary data exclusively to my verified Guardian account. I sat at my dining table, the morning light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and downloaded the heavily protected PDF. I entered the multi-tier authentication passwords required to open it. I did not feel a sense of vindication as the document rendered on my screen. I felt the cold, hyper-focused attachment that always accompanied the most difficult case files at my office. The first 2 pages of the report contained the standard bureaucratic audit trail I had requested. It meticulously documented Beatrice's digital footprints, the creation of the account, the uploaded scan of my forged signature, the IP address originating from the Ashford estate's primary router, and the receipt for an expedited processing fee paid via a corporate card belonging to the Ashford Children's Trust. She had not even used her personal funds to violate my children's privacy. She had billed it to a charity. The 3rd page contained the preliminary kinship findings. I read through the clinical data, parsing the genetic markers and the calculated probability percentages. As I had suspected, Beatrice had requested a comparative sibling analysis between Ava and Leo. The conclusion printed at the bottom of the page was absolute. The subjects share a significant amount of autosomal DNA, consistent with a half-sibling relationship. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the bolded text. I understood exactly how Beatrice's mind had processed this strategy. She knew that Julian was not Ava's father. Therefore, if a laboratory confirmed that Leo and Ava were biologically related, Beatrice intended to present this as irrefutable scientific proof that they shared the same father, Tom Moore. She planned to stand in front of the trust's board and declare that I was a fraud who had passed off my ex-husband's child as an Ashford heir. It was a spectacularly arrogant miscalculation, born entirely from a toxic combination of desperation and scientific ignorance. Ava and Leo shared an extensive amount of DNA because they shared the exact same mother. Beatrice had spent thousands of pounds and committed multiple data protection felonies to legally verify a biological reality that I had carried in my own body. She had built a trap with a massive, foundational flaw. But as I scrolled down to the 4th page of the document, the parameters of the situation shifted from a localized family dispute into a devastating, decades-old cover-up. When Beatrice registered the samples, she had clearly checked the authorization box for the laboratory's extended familial matching database. It was a premium feature often used in private investigations to locate distant relatives. She had likely done this hoping the system would pull up a genetic link to the Moore family, providing her with the final nail in my coffin. The system did find an extended match, but it did not belong to my side of the family. Under the heading labeled Significant Unanticipated Kinship Matches, the laboratory software had flagged a direct hit in the National Registry for Leo's paternal line. Subject: Nora Vale. Estimated relationship: half-aunt/close paternal relative. Shared DNA: 24.8%. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, entirely indifferent to the catastrophic weight of the text it was hovering beside. I knew the name Nora Vale. Anyone currently involved in the periphery of the Ashford Children's Trust knew the name. She was the prominent investigative journalist who had been formally invited by Beatrice to attend the upcoming St. Aldwyn's Gala. She was supposed to write a glowing, long-form editorial about the family's philanthropic dedication to children from fractured backgrounds. But my recognition of the name went much deeper than a guest list. My mind snapped back 3 years, returning to the dimly lit filing room of the Family Services Organization where I had spent countless evenings digitizing closed adoption records. I remembered the heavy, redacted dossier originating from a wealthy Somerset jurisdiction. I remembered the case of an adult adoptee who had formally petitioned the state to unseal her original birth records, searching for the mother who had relinquished her over 3 decades ago. The adoptee's name on that petition was Nora Vale. I closed my eyes, visualizing the physical contents of that old file with the trained precision of an archivist. There had been no father listed on the original birth certificate. The biological mother's name had been Rosalind Keene, a 19-year-old library assistant on a modest bursary program at St. Aldwyn's School. And then there was the photograph. It was a slightly out-of-focus Polaroid tucked into the back pocket of the dossier, taken outside the wrought iron side gates of St. Aldwyn's. It featured a terrified young Rosalind awkwardly holding a newborn infant wrapped in a hospital blanket. But it was the secondary figure in the background that had always bothered me, a sharp, elegantly dressed woman with rigid posture, holding a large manila envelope. In the photograph, The older woman had been wearing a distinctive piece of silver jewelry on the lapel of her coat. A swooping swallow. I opened my eyes and looked back at the glowing screen. The DNA did not lie. Nora Vale was heavily related to Leo through his paternal line, meaning she shared direct blood with Julian. Given the timeline and the percentage of shared genetic material, there was only one mathematical certainty. Nora Vale was the biological daughter of Graham Ashford, conceived just before or during the early stages of his engagement to Beatrice. Beatrice had not merely known about her husband's illegitimate child. She had actively orchestrated the infant's removal. She had used her authority at St. Aldwyn's to force a vulnerable 19-year-old girl to hand over her baby, ensuring the Ashford reputation remained untarnished. She had erased a child from the family tree, and now, 33 years later, she had unknowingly invited that exact same child to a gala to write a tribute to her maternal benevolence. The sheer, suffocating hypocrisy of it settled over me like a heavy winter coat. The woman who constantly degraded me for bringing a child from a previous life into the Ashford home had personally discarded an Ashford child when it threatened her social standing. I picked up my phone and dialed Priya Desai's direct line. She answered on the second ring. "I have the Wessex audit," I said, bypassing all pleasantries. Beatrice forged my signature, just as we suspected. But the database pulled an extended match on Leo's paternal side. "Priya, the match is Nora Vale." Silence fell over the line. Even Priya, a lawyer who had spent a decade navigating the darkest corners of family litigation, required a moment to process the magnitude of the revelation. "The journalist?" Priya asked, her voice dropping an octave. "The one Beatrice hired to cover the trust launch?" "Yes," I confirmed. "And I know her original file. I processed the digitization of her unsealing petition 3 years ago. Nora is Graham's biological daughter. Beatrice was physically present the day the baby was handed over to the agency." Priya exhaled slowly into the receiver. "Eliza, this is a nuclear deterrent. If you place this on the table, the entire Ashford Foundation collapses. But we have a severe legal constraint here. You possess this genetic knowledge due to a breach initiated by Beatrice, but Nora Vale is an innocent third party. Her adoption records and her genetic privacy are protected. You cannot unilaterally out her trauma to save yourself at a gala." "I know," I replied firmly. "I have no intention of dragging another woman onto a public stage without her consent. I am not Beatrice. I do not use people as human shields." "Good," Priya said, the professional sharpness returning to her tone. "We proceed strictly through established channels. Since Nora previously registered with the state adoption registry seeking her biological family, and since this DNA match occurred within a compliant system, you have legal grounds to initiate contact. But you must let her make the final decision." "I will reach out to her today," I said. "Do it carefully, Eliza," Priya warned. "You are about to tell a woman that the philanthropic society she is currently profiling is run by the exact same people who erased her existence." I ended the call and opened a blank email draft. I did not use my personal account. I used my encrypted professional address. I typed Nora Vale's contact information into the recipient line. I kept the message brief, devoid of emotional manipulation or leading statements. I simply stated my name, my professional capacity, and the fact that a verified, highly sensitive genetic match had occurred within a secure portal regarding her ongoing search for her family of origin. I requested a private meeting. I hit send, closed the laptop, and walked into the kitchen to pour my cold coffee down the sink. Beatrice Ashford thought she was carefully arranging the pieces on a chessboard to corner me. She had no idea she was playing on a board suspended over a minefield of her own making, and the detonation sequence had just been activated. Chapter 9. The Girl in the Photograph. We met at a quiet, wood-paneled cafe near the Bath Spa station, the relentless Somerset drizzle blurring the historic limestone buildings outside into muted strokes of gray. I arrived early with Priya, whose legal portfolio rested squarely on our table. We weren't there to negotiate a settlement or build a defense against Beatrice Ashford's absurd paternity claims. We were there to hand a 33-year-old woman the final missing piece of her identity. Nora Vale walked through the glass door precisely on time. She possessed the sharp, assessing gaze of a seasoned investigative journalist. Up close, the architectural similarities in her face were undeniable: the straight jaw, the sloped brow. She looked like Julian, stripped of his aristocratic hesitation and reinforced with something much harder. After brief, formal introductions ensuring our compliance with the Data Protection Act, Nora slid into the booth opposite us. Skipping pleasantries, she retrieved a thick, heavily creased cardboard folder from her worn leather messenger bag. "You stated your secure system found a genetic match to my closed adoption file," Nora began, her voice professional but carrying an undercurrent of tightly coiled tension. "I already possess the majority of the narrative. I am simply missing the surname." Nora turned the folder toward me. The top document was a heavily redacted birth certificate. However, the mother's name was clearly visible: Rosalind Keene. "My mother was a 19-year-old library assistant at St. Aldwyn's School," Nora explained, tracing the paper's edge. "She died when I was 17. I was raised by wonderful adoptive parents, but after they passed, I discovered my adoption wasn't handled through standard services. It was facilitated by a private agency and heavily subsidized by a blind trust operating out of Somerset. They funded my education and living expenses, payments that ceased entirely the month I turned 18. It was classic Ashford wealth management: throw an overwhelming amount of money at a complication until it disappears, ensuring no legal or social liability remains. There is one specific item that led me to accept the journalistic assignment covering the Ashford Children's Trust this week," Nora said, withdrawing a faded photograph from the folder. "I recognized the heavy, ornate wrought iron gates of St. Aldwyn's School instantly. In the foreground stood Rosalind Keene, looking incredibly frightened, awkwardly cradling a newborn in a hospital blanket. But the background anchored the entire tragedy. Standing in the shadow of the gatepost was a younger Beatrice Ashford, holding a manila envelope. Pinned to her tailored coat was her unmistakable silver swallow brooch. She was merely engaged to Graham Ashford at the time," Nora stated. "For 3 years, I have wondered why the future matriarch of the estate personally supervised the relinquishment of a teenager's baby." The sheer weight of Beatrice's hypocrisy settled over the table. "The woman who constantly degraded me for bringing a child from a previous marriage into her pristine family tree had personally forced a vulnerable teenager to hand over an Ashford child. She had built her moral superiority on a foundation of devastating cruelty. Beatrice commissioned a genetic test to target my children," I explained softly. "She illegally obtained DNA from my son, Leo, and my daughter, Ava, hoping to prove they shared the same father. Instead, her extended database search flagged a direct hit on the National Registry for Leo's paternal line." I slid the encrypted Wessex audit report across the table. Nora read the bolded text: "Estimated relationship, half-aunt/close paternal relative. Shared DNA, 24.8%. Graham Ashford is your father," I said gently. "Given the timeline, you were conceived right before his engagement to Beatrice. She orchestrated all of it to ensure Graham's indiscretion did not compromise their impending marriage or social standing." Nora lightly brushed her thumb over her terrified mother's image. She did not cry. It was a profound consolidation of a lifelong injustice finally being given a name. "She invited me to this gala. She wants me to write an editorial praising her dedication to vulnerable children. She invited the daughter she threw away to applaud her philanthropy." "Beatrice does not know who you are, Nora," Priya intervened gently. "She is completely unaware this evidence exists." I leaned forward, folding my hands. "Nora, I possess the legal authority to expose Beatrice's fraudulent DNA test tonight. I have everything I need to dismantle her. But your genetic privacy is absolute. If you want to walk out of this cafe and never speak to the Ashfords, I will completely respect that boundary. I will handle Beatrice on my own terms. I will not push you onto a public stage to serve as my shield." Nora studied my face for a long time, evaluating my sincerity. When she found no hidden manipulation, her rigid posture finally softened. She placed the photograph and the audit report into her leather bag. "My mother died believing she had ruined her own life, while the people who dismantled it went on to run charities in their own name, Nora said, her voice dropping to a register of unbreakable resolve. She stood up, offering a small, sharp smile. I am still attending the gala, Eliza. If Beatrice intends to preach about the absolute importance of family truth tonight, I think it is only fair she is finally introduced to her own. The trap was fully set. Beatrice believed she was walking in with a cream envelope that would destroy my life. She had no idea I held a folder that would systematically dismantle her forgery, and she was entirely oblivious that the journalist in the third row carried a photograph that would burn the Ashford legacy to the ground. Chapter 10. Reading the rest of the file. We were back in the Great Hall of St. Aldwyn's School, the precise moment the evening fractured. Beatrice stood at the podium, her posture immaculate, the heavy cream envelope resting against the polished mahogany wood. The ambient noise evaporated into a suffocating silence as wealthy alumni and board members stared at the stage. Beatrice looked down at Julian with perfectly engineered maternal sorrow. The Ashford Children's Trust cannot be built on deception. Julian, the test results inside this envelope reveal a difficult truth. The laboratory confirms that Ava and Leo share a significant genetic relationship. I only wanted to protect you from raising a child that belongs to another man's history. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. She was branding me an adulteress in front of the entire county. Beside me, Ava trembled beneath her velvet dress, trying to suppress a sob. Julian stood frozen, struggling to reconcile the mother he knew with the public execution currently taking place. I did not scream or beg for my husband's trust. I simply stood up, picked up my gray administrative folder, and walked to the stage. I placed a steady hand on Julian's forearm before turning entirely to Beatrice. You are absolutely correct about the genetic relationship, Beatrice, I stated, my voice echoing clearly through her microphone. Ava and Leo share a significant amount of DNA. That is the fundamental biological reality of two children carried by the exact same mother. A profound stillness descended as the blinding scientific ignorance of Beatrice's plan became apparent to everyone with a basic understanding of human biology. I handed the cream envelope directly to Julian. Read the testing parameters. Beatrice did not commission a paternity test between you and your son. She commissioned a comparative sibling analysis between a toddler and a 9-year-old girl. Julian scanned the laboratory headers, the reality of the missing teething ring and stolen hairbrush finally materializing in his mind. As the color drained from his face, I placed my notarized documents squarely on the podium. This is a legally binding paternity analysis conducted by a secure clinic, I explained to Julian. The results confirm a 99.9% probability. You are Leo's father. A fact never in question by anyone except your mother. Julian looked entirely devastated. He turned to the woman who had raised him. You took DNA from my son? You stole hair from my daughter. It was the first time Julian had ever called Ava his daughter in front of his mother. He claimed her instantly and publicly in the exact space where Beatrice had tried to erase her. Beatrice's flawless composure cracked. Her fingers trembled against her silver brooch. I was only trying to protect the estate. She comes from a fractured background. I had to be certain. You did not protect anything, I intervened, adopting the flattened authority I used in court. I turned to Martin Bellamy, the Trust's chief legal counsel, and handed him the printed audit trail. Mr. Bellamy, Beatrice submitted a forged digital scan of my signature to authorize the biometric processing of 2 minors without maternal consent. Furthermore, the expedited laboratory fees were paid using a corporate credit card belonging to this trust. Bellamy's eyes darted over the server logs. A corporate lawyer's loyalty belongs entirely to the institution. He took a deliberate step away from Beatrice. Mrs. Ashford, if you use trust funds to facilitate a fraudulent biometric analysis on minors, the board will initiate an immediate internal investigation. The procedure is severely compromised. Panic, raw and unpolished, bled through Beatrice's aristocratic veneer. She gestured sharply toward me. I am attempting to preserve the integrity of this family. At least I never brought an unknown child with no proper origin into another family's home and demanded they be given a seat at the table. No, a new voice echoed from the third row. You just forced them out the back door instead. Nora Vale stood up. She walked down the center aisle with the steady pace of a woman who had waited 33 years to cover this exact distance. Reaching the podium, she retrieved the faded photograph from her bag and placed it directly over the forged DNA results. My name is Nora Vale. I am an investigative journalist, and I am the adoptee listed in the sealed file this photograph belongs to. Beatrice stared at the image of the terrified girl and her own younger self in the background. The sophisticated, cutting vocabulary she had utilized her entire life entirely failed her. The genetic test you illegally commissioned triggered a secondary search, Nora explained with heavy authority. The system found a 24% match between Leo Ashford and myself, a half-aunt relationship on the paternal line. Nora directed her gaze to Graham Ashford, who sat in detached silence. I am the biological daughter of Rosalind Keene and Graham Ashford. And you, Beatrice, used an anonymous blind trust to remove me so your impending marriage would not be inconvenienced by a 19-year-old library assistant. The Great Hall was paralyzed. The prestigious Ashford legacy had just been exposed as a monument built over an abandoned child. Graham pushed his chair back, his shoulders surrendering to the weight of the secret. He looked directly at Nora. Beatrice, he said, his voice ragged and hollow. That arrangement. It should never have been buried like this. Gripping the edges of the podium, Beatrice frantically searched for a way to reassert control. She turned her venom toward me. You orchestrated this. You brought this woman here to ruin me. I looked at a woman who possessed millions of pounds and a network of power. But in that moment, stripped of her secrets, she was nothing more than a desperate architect standing inside a collapsing building of her own design. No, Beatrice, I replied softly, my voice perfectly steady in the vast hall. You registered the fraudulent genetic test. You invited the investigative journalist to cover your charity. You brought my children onto a public stage. I didn't orchestrate anything tonight. I merely read the rest of the file. Chapter 11. The doors that close very quietly. The dismantling of Beatrice Ashford's authority happened exactly the way systemic power unravels, in quiet boardrooms, through carefully worded memos, and via the sudden, chilling distance of wealthy peers protecting their own liabilities. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the board unanimously voted to suspend the scholarship initiative. Pending a forensic audit of historical family funds, Beatrice was formally requested to step down. Her reputation as the grand protector of vulnerable children had evaporated, suffocated by the sheer hypocrisy of her own actions. My retaliation was equally devoid of theatrics. Priya drafted a comprehensive cease and desist letter on the heavy stationery of her Bristol law firm. It formally prohibited Beatrice from accessing any data pertaining to Leo and Ava, warned that further violations would result in a family court filing, and functioned as a heavy iron gate slamming shut across the pathway she had used to terrorize my household. A week later, Graham reached out to Nora for a private meeting. Nora recounted it to me that evening. Sitting on a neutral bench in Royal Victoria Park, she had asked him exactly how long he had known she existed. 33 years, he had told her. From the day Rosalind informed the school she was pregnant. So I told him the truth, Nora said, her voice projecting steady calm. I told him, then you did not lose me, Graham. You discarded me. He didn't try to argue. I think it was the first time in his life someone didn't allow him to hide behind Beatrice's cruelty. In our own flat, the aftermath required a different kind of reconstruction. Julian was fundamentally shattered by the realization of his mother's capabilities and his own passive complicity. He began attending therapy twice a week to dismantle 3 decades of conditioned obedience. I am so sorry, Eliza, Julian said one evening, his voice thick with remorse. I forced you to sit at tables where they diminished you. I left you to fight her completely alone. I held his gaze steadily. I understand how difficult it is to recognize the toxicity of the environment that built you. But I need you to understand that your silence was her greatest weapon. I need you to stop letting your desire for peace make her stronger, because the peace you were protecting was entirely paid for by my daughter's isolation. Julian absorbed the words without retreating into defensiveness, a quiet, resolute acceptance settling over his features. His most important apology, however, was directed at Ava. The following Saturday, Julian sat at eye level in Ava's bedroom. He didn't offer a generalized apology or attempt to smooth over the event by calling it a misunderstanding. Ava, I allowed people to make you feel as though you were just a guest in your own home, Julian began, his voice incredibly gentle. It was my job to stop them, and I failed. I was entirely wrong. Ava looked at him, her amber eyes wide, processing a level of accountability she had never experienced. So, what am I then? Julian did not hesitate. You are the daughter of this family. You are exactly where you belong, and I will never let anyone tell you otherwise again. Listening from the hallway, I watched the physical tension drain from Ava's small shoulders. It was the first solid, unshakable stone laid in the foundation of her actual home. Chapter 12. Family is not a clean bloodline. 6 months later, the aggressive Somerset winter had softened into a mild, forgiving spring. I was walking along the River Avon, pushing Leo while Julian walked beside me. Ava ran ahead, pointing out swans to her younger brother with serious, academic authority. Our family was not entirely perfect, but it was fundamentally honest. The superficial gloss of the Ashford legacy had been stripped away, leaving behind something infinitely stronger. Julian was unlearning his defensive mechanisms. When his sister made a passively critical comment recently, he corrected her immediately, finally understanding that a boundary only holds value if enforced the moment it is tested. Ava's moments of doubt were becoming increasingly rare, replaced by the natural confidence of a child whose position is no longer conditional. 2 days before Ava's 10th birthday, a heavy envelope arrived from Ashford House. Inside was a beautifully letterpressed card, completely devoid of Beatrice's performative warmth. To Ava, with respect. Beatrice. I didn't view the message as a sincere apology. It was a formal surrender. She was acknowledging that the walls I had built around my children were impenetrable. She didn't love Ava, but she was finally forced to respect her presence. Public accountability arrived when Nora published a comprehensive editorial. Without naming Beatrice or Graham directly, she meticulously dismantled the culture of wealthy family trusts that prioritized institutional reputation over the welfare of vulnerable children. Nora and Julian had also begun a slow, highly moderated email correspondence. They weren't attempting to forge an artificial sibling bond to compensate for lost years. They were simply two adults, sharing a fraction of their DNA, building a bridge on their own terms, free from the crushing weight of the Ashford name. Later that evening, I walked into my home office and retrieved the gray administrative folder. I looked at the documented history of a woman's attempt to erase my daughter and steal my son. I didn't keep it as a trophy of victory or out of resentment. I kept it because history left undocumented has a terrifying tendency to rewrite itself to favor the powerful. I closed the folder, sliding it smoothly back into the filing cabinet, securing the documents in the exact place they belonged, the past. I used to think a boundary was simply a wall you constructed to keep toxic people out. I understand now that a boundary was the very first door I ever built so my children could stay inside, safe, called by their true names, and never again forced to serve as the evidence of an adult's sins. For the first time in my life, my silence was not a surrender. It was peace.